Somewhere behind your ears, right now, a quiet piece of machinery is already at work, guessing what sound is going to arrive next, shaping the shape of your listening before the next word even lands. You didn't ask it to do this. It doesn't wait for permission. Your brain has been a prediction machine for longer than you've had language. And tonight, as you lie here, it's doing what it always does, reaching very slightly ahead of the present moment to make a small forecast about what comfort will feel like in about 2 seconds from now. This is worth pausing on, because it's a strange and useful place to start. Most of us walk around assuming that our senses work like a camera. Light comes in, the eye records it, the brain simply reports what happened. Sound arrives, the ear catches it, and the mind takes notes. It feels passive, like a recording device. But that's not quite what's happening. Even in this ordinary moment, listening to a voice in the dark, your brain isn't just receiving, it's predicting, and then checking its prediction against what actually arrives, and adjusting the felt experience based on how close the guess was. If the next sound is close enough to what was expected, it can even feel a little more pleasant than a totally unexpected sound would, simply because expectation and arrival lined up so smoothly. That small, private event, a guess quietly meeting reality, is happening constantly, underneath conscious awareness, all night and all day. It's the same kind of process, in a much smaller and gentler form, that lies at the center of a phenomenon doctors have been arguing about for more than 2 centuries. We usually call it the placebo effect, though tonight I'd rather not use that word too quickly, because the word itself carries a lot of old baggage, and some of that baggage isn't accurate. So instead, let's come at it from underneath, the way your nervous system came at this evening's listening, quietly, before any label got attached. Here is the shape of the paradox, stated plainly, so it can sit in the room with us for the rest of this hour. A person is given something that has no active ingredient, a sugar pill, a saline injection, sometimes even a sham surgery, where the surgeon opens the skin and closes it again without doing the procedure that was supposedly happening. And in a striking number of cases, that person's symptoms improve. Not always, not for everything, but often enough, and sometimes substantially enough, that this improvement shows up clearly in careful, controlled research, not just in a patient's private impression of feeling slightly better. Now, the immediate temptation, when people first hear this, is to reach for a very tidy explanation. And the tidy explanation usually sounds something like this. Well, it must mean the person wasn't really sick in the first place. If a fake treatment worked, the thinking goes, then the real problem must have been imaginary all along, something psychological, something that was never truly in the body to begin with. I want to gently set that explanation aside tonight, not because it's a foolish thought. It's actually a very natural one, but because it doesn't hold up against what researchers have actually found when they've looked closely. And looking closely is really what this whole night is about. Consider something concrete, something with texture, the way your fingertips have texture, even in the dark. Imagine a person with real, measurable inflammation in a joint. The kind that shows up on a scan, the kind an outside observer could photograph. Give that person a treatment they believe is going to reduce their pain, even if the treatment itself is inert. And in some studies, their reported pain
does go down, sometimes by an amount comparable to a mild dose of an actual painkiller. Their swelling, though, the physical inflammation itself, often does not vanish. So something changed. Something real changed. And it was measurable. And it happened without any active drug entering the body. But something else, the underlying tissue, may not have changed at all. Two different layers of the same experience, moved differently. That's the paradox in miniature, small enough to hold in your hand, before we spend the rest of the night turning it over. This is where it helps to come back to that quiet, predictive machinery we started with. The part of your brain that's guessing what happens next. All the time. About everything. Pain, it turns out, is not simply a straightforward readout of tissue damage, the way a car's fuel gauge is a straightforward readout of how much gasoline is in the tank. Pain is something your nervous system constructs, moment to moment, using signals from the body, yes, but also using expectation, memory, context, and belief. The way a chef combines several ingredients into a single dish, where no single ingredient alone would taste anything like the final result. When you expect relief, and that expectation is strong and specific enough, it can genuinely shift the chemical and neural activity involved in how pain is processed and experienced. Not because the injury disappeared, but because pain itself is partly, not entirely, but partly, a story your nervous system is telling about the injury, and expectation is one of the narrators.
Think of a lighthouse keeper from centuries ago, someone whose whole job was to watch the horizon for a ship that was expected at a particular hour. If the keeper believed, with real confidence, that the ship would appear right on schedule, his eyes would scan the horizon differently than if he believed the ship might never come at all. He wasn't imagining the ship into existence. The ship was either really there, or it wasn't, entirely independent of his belief. But his belief absolutely changed how he searched, how quickly he noticed the first smudge of sail against gray water, maybe even how his pulse behaved as dusk approached. Expectation didn't create the ship. It shaped the experience of watching for it. The body, in something like this same way, doesn't invent illness or invent wellness out of nothing, but it can genuinely shift how symptoms are processed, amplified, or eased, depending on what it has been led, quite reasonably, to expect. This is why careful researchers, the ones who've spent entire careers on this question, tend to bristle slightly at the phrase, all in your head, because that phrase suggests a fake process sitting somewhere separate from the body, a kind of illusion layered on top of physical reality like a coat of paint that could simply be scraped off to reveal the truth underneath. But your head, meaning your brain, and everything connected to it, is not separate from your body. It's soaked into it, threaded through it, in constant two-way conversation with your immune system, your hormones, your digestion, your heart rate, using chemical messengers that don't stop to check whether a signal originated from something you swallowed or something you merely believed. A belief, once it takes hold strongly enough, can trigger the release of real molecules, in real time, inside real tissue. None of this means expectation is some kind of magic wand that can be waved over any condition to make it disappear. That would be its own oversimplification, just pointed in the opposite direction. And we're going to spend time later tonight on exactly where the limits are.
because they matter, and they're more interesting than a simple yes or a simple no. What tends to shift most reliably under the influence of expectation are things like the perception of pain, nausea, fatigue, mood, and certain aspects of how the body regulates itself. What tends not to shift are things like tumor size, or a bacterial infection actively multiplying, or a broken bone knitting back together. Expectation is a real, physiological force, but it is not an unlimited one, and understanding where its influence ends is just as important as understanding where it begins. For now, though, before we go further into the history and the mechanisms and the strange edge cases that make this topic endlessly fascinating to the people who study it, I want you to simply notice, one more time, that quiet prediction still running underneath your own listening tonight. Your brain, forecasting the next word, the next pause, the next small shift in tone, and adjusting your experience of this moment accordingly, gently, without any effort from you at all. That soft, automatic process of expecting and then experiencing is the same kind of process, just turned toward comfort itself, that we're about to spend the rest of this night slowly, carefully unpacking, starting with where this whole puzzling idea first got its name.
Let's slow down for a moment and get some words sorted out, gently, because the language around this topic is looser than people assume, and a lot of confusion later tonight will trace back to words used as if they mean one thing when they actually mean several. Start with the phrase placebo effect itself. It sounds like a single, tidy phenomenon, something you could point to and say, "There, that's it. That's the placebo effect." But researchers who spend their careers on this increasingly avoid using it that way because it bundles together things that don't behave alike. A more careful phrase, one you'll hear more as tonight goes on, is placebo response. A response is something measured in a person, a change noticed after they were given something inert, something with no active ingredient at all, a sugar pill, a saline injection, a sham procedure where nothing was actually done to the body. The response is the change itself, whatever caused it. The effect, technically, is something narrower and harder to pin down. It's the portion of that response that can be attributed specifically to the psychological and contextual machinery we've been talking about, the belief, the ritual, the expectation, once every other possible explanation has been carefully subtracted away. And there are other explanations, more of them than most people realize, quietly mixed into what looks, at first glance, like the mind healing the body. Think about a person with lower back pain who joins a study, takes a sugar pill for 6 weeks, and reports feeling better. Some of that improvement might come from expectation, yes, but some of it might simply be the natural course of lower back pain, which very often gets better on its own, regardless of what anyone does, because bodies are self-limiting systems, and most minor injuries resolve with or without intervention. Some of it might be a statistical quirk called regression to the mean, which is a slightly dry phrase for a very ordinary pattern. People tend to sign up for studies when they're at their worst, and when you measure anything at its worst point, the next measurement, almost no matter what you do in between, tends to drift back toward average. Not because anything worked, just because extremes don't usually stay extreme. Some of the improvement might come from the extra attention itself, a phenomenon sometimes loosely tied to the old Hawthorne studies, where people who know they're being watched, measured, checked in on, start behaving differently simply because of that attention, independent of any treatment at all.
Some of it might come from people wanting to please the researcher who's been kind to them, so they round their pain rating down a little, without fully realizing they're doing it. Untangling genuine placebo response from these overlapping currents is part of why this field is so slow and so careful, and why a good placebo study needs more than just an inert pill and a hopeful patient. Now, set beside all of this, the placebo's quieter, less talked about sibling, the nocebo effect. Nocebo is Latin, roughly, for I shall harm, sitting in deliberate contrast to placebo's I shall please. It describes the same basic mechanism, expectation shaping bodily experience, but running in the opposite direction. Tell someone a treatment causes headaches, and give them an inert pill, and a meaningful number of them will report headaches. Read a list of possible side effects aloud before administering a dummy injection, and some of those side effects will reliably show up anyway, generated not by any chemical, but by the warning itself. This is not people faking it or imagining it in some dismissive sense. Their nervous systems are doing exactly what nervous systems do, using prior information to shape present sensation, the same machinery, just steering toward dread instead of relief. The nocebo effect matters enormously in ordinary medicine, far beyond the walls of a research lab. It's part of why the fine print on a medication insert, the long list of possible side effects a pharmacist hands you along with your prescription, can sometimes cause a small uptick in exactly those symptoms among people taking the real drug. Doctors have known for a long time, informally, that how they say something changes what a patient experiences, and modern researchers are only now building careful, respectful ways to study that without simply telling doctors to lie or withhold information, which raises its own tangle of ethical problems we'll sit with in a little while. Then there's a phrase you'll hear again and again tonight, treatment context, sometimes called the therapeutic context or the clinical ritual. This is the entire surrounding scaffolding of a medical encounter, separate from whatever active substance might or might not be involved. The white coat, the stethoscope resting around a doctor's neck, the particular hush of a waiting room, the confident tone in a clinician's voice when they say, "This should help," the size, color, and even the price of a pill, all of which, oddly enough, measurably influence how effective people expect it to be, and therefore how effective it often turns out to feel. Larger pills are frequently rated as stronger than smaller ones, even when the contents are identical. 2 sugar pills often produce a bigger response than one, simply by suggesting more effort, more strength, more seriousness of intent. Capsules tend to outperform tablets. Injections tend to outperform pills, likely because they feel more invasive, more medical, more consequential.
None of this is a person being foolish. It's a person's brain doing its ordinary work of reading context for clues. The same work it does everywhere else in life, applied here to the specific, high-stakes context of being cared for. And this is where inert controls come in, the plain, unglamorous backbone of every placebo study ever run. An inert control is simply something given to a person that contains no active therapeutic ingredient, designed to look, taste, and feel as much like the real treatment as possible, so that expectation, ritual, and context stay roughly equal between 2 groups of people, while only one group receives the thing actually being tested. Without that matching inert version, a researcher can never really know whether an improvement came from the drug or from everything else layered around the drug, the coat, the tone, the ritual, the simple passage of time. Which brings us, gently, to why this whole area is so ethically tangled, historically speaking.
For a very long stretch of medical history, doctors gave people things that didn't work, and often knew, or at least strongly suspected, that they didn't work, and did it anyway, because doing something felt better than doing nothing, for the doctor and for the patient both.
Red pills, colored water, sugar tablets, dispensed with total sincerity, sometimes called, quite openly among physicians of the era, an obedient remedy, something to satisfy a patient's need for care without any real pharmacological action behind it. This wasn't universally seen as deceptive, so much as it was seen as kind, a way of honoring the relationship between doctor and patient when medicine itself had so little else to offer. But as medicine matured, as pharmacology grew teeth, that same practice started to look less like kindness and more like a problem. If doctors could get people to feel better with an inert pill dressed up convincingly, then any study that simply asked, "Did the patient improve after taking the real drug?" was hopelessly contaminated, unable to distinguish a true chemical effect from the same soft, contextual comfort a sugar pill could offer just as easily. You could give someone a genuinely powerful new medicine, watch them get better, and have almost no way of knowing whether the molecule did the work, or whether the ritual of receiving care did the work, or some blend of both, in proportions no one could see. That uncertainty is exactly why modern trials lean so heavily on three particular tools working together: control groups, randomization, and blinding, each one built to answer a specific worry the others can't fully cover on their own. A control group exists, so there's a baseline to compare against, a way of asking, compared to what? Randomization exists, so the two groups start out roughly alike in every way that matters: health, age, mindset, expectation, so that any difference measured afterward can't simply be chalked up to one group being different, healthier, or more hopeful than the other from the very start. And blinding exists because of everything we've just spent this section unpacking, because knowing which pill you're taking changes how your own body responds to it, and because a doctor who knows which patient got the real drug may, without meaning to, communicate that difference through nothing more than a slightly warmer tone of voice. It's this last piece, blinding, and its stranger, more deliberate cousin, double blinding, that we're going to slip into next, because the story of how researchers learned to hide the truth even from themselves is one of the more quietly ingenious chapters in the whole history of medicine. Let's set that story aside for a moment, though we'll return to it, and turn instead toward one particular kind of experience, where all of this stops being abstract and becomes something almost everyone has felt directly: pain. Because if you want to understand why expectation and context can do real, measurable things inside a body, pain is where the evidence is clearest, and also where the misunderstandings are thickest. Most of us grow up with a simple picture of pain in our heads. Something happens to the body: a burn, a cut, a sprained ankle, and a signal travels up a wire to the brain where it registers as hurt in an amount roughly proportional to the damage. More injury, more pain. Less injury, less pain. It feels obvious, almost too obvious to question, the way it feels obvious that a thermometer simply reads the temperature of a room. But pain doesn't quite work that way, and the ways it doesn't are worth sitting with slowly, because they explain so much of what follows. Consider the soldier and the office worker, a comparison drawn from research done in the years following the Second World War by an anesthesiologist named Henry Beecher. who worked on wounded soldiers near the beaches of Anzio in Italy. Beecher noticed something that unsettled his own assumptions. Men with severe wounds, shattered bone, torn tissue, injuries that would have sent a civilian into agony, sometimes asked for little or no morphine. They weren't stoic in some abstract, heroic sense. Beecher's own explanation was more specific than that. For a soldier, a bad wound could mean the war was over, that he'd survive to see home again, that the worst part of his ordeal had just become the reason he'd get to leave it. For a civilian, struck by a car back home, a comparable injury meant something entirely different: a disruption, a financial burden, an unwelcome intrusion into an otherwise safe life. Same tissue damage, roughly speaking, wildly different amounts of reported pain. This is the detail that matters here, and it's worth turning over gently before moving on. Beecher wasn't suggesting the wounds weren't real, or that the soldiers were somehow imagining less pain than they should have. He was noticing that the meaning of an injury seemed to shape how much it hurt, not just whether someone complained about it, but the actual felt intensity of the sensation itself. That single observation nudges us toward a much stranger, much better supported idea, one that took modern neuroscience decades to properly formalize. Pain isn't a simple readout of tissue damage. Pain is something closer to a conclusion. Your brain builds it, moment to moment, out of a whole collection of ingredients, only one of which is the raw sensory signal coming up from the site of an injury. Think of it less like a thermometer and more like a judge listening to witnesses. The sensory nerves are one witness, reporting on heat, pressure, chemical irritation, the physical facts on the ground, but other witnesses are testifying too. Attention is a witness, because pain you're bracing for, watching, dreading, tends to feel larger than pain that catches you mid-conversation, distracted, thinking about something else entirely. Memory is a witness, because a body that has been badly hurt in a particular way before sometimes treats a similar sensation with more alarm the second time around, the way a smoke detector that's gone off during a real fire might trigger more readily afterward, even at the smell of burnt toast. And threat is a witness too, maybe the most important one, because your nervous system is constantly, quietly asking a background question underneath the sensation itself. How dangerous is this, really? And the answer to that question changes the verdict. This is why the same sensation can mean such different things, depending on where it happens and what surrounds it. A sharp pain in your side during a run might barely register, filed away as a stitch, an inconvenience. That same sharp pain in your side, appearing out of nowhere while you're lying in bed at 3 a.m, thinking about appendicitis you read about once, can feel enormous, can pull your whole attention into a tight, urgent knot. The tissue, in that moment, hasn't necessarily changed at all. The context has changed completely, and the brain's judgment about danger has changed along with it, and so has the pain. None of this means pain is optional, or that thinking your way past an injury makes the injury disappear. That's an important distinction to hold on to, gently, as we go further into this. A broken bone doesn't heal because you decided not to be alarmed by it. A burn still damages tissue, whether or not you're paying attention to it. The sensory witness is still testifying, still reporting real information from the body, and no amount of context can invent damage that isn't there, or erase damage that is. What context and attention and threat can do
And this is the part worth sitting with slowly, is change how loudly that testimony gets weighted, how the brain assembles the final verdict out of everything it's hearing at once. And your brain has actual machinery for doing this weighting, not metaphorical machinery, but real, physical pathways that run from the brain back down into the spinal cord, adjusting the volume on incoming pain signals before they've even finished arriving. This is called descending modulation, and it's one of the more elegant discoveries in the history of pain science. Signals don't just travel one direction, from body to brain, like mail, moving up a single chute. The brain sends instructions back down too, telling the spinal cord to turn certain signals up, or to turn them down, depending on what the brain has decided, based on everything it's currently paying attention to, is worth amplifying or worth quieting. Some of the clearest early evidence for this came from a discovery in the 1970s, when researchers found that the brain produces its own natural pain-relieving chemicals, endorphins, and related compounds, released in response to certain kinds of stress, certain kinds of expectation, certain contexts the body has learned to associate with safety or relief. This wasn't imagination dressed up as biology. These were measurable molecules doing measurable work, binding to real receptors, altering how strongly a pain signal registered by the time it reached conscious awareness. And crucially, researchers found that if you blocked those receptors with a drug called naloxone, certain kinds of expectation-driven pain relief could be reduced or wiped out entirely, which is about as strong a piece of evidence as biology tends to offer, because it shows the effect running through an actual chemical pathway, not through willpower, not through distraction alone, but through the body's own internal pharmacy, responding to context and expectation the same way it might respond to an injected drug. This is worth pausing on, because it reframes the whole question we started with back at Anzio. The soldiers weren't simply choosing to feel less pain, gritting their teeth through it by force of character. Something in the meaning of their situation, survival, homecoming, the war behind them instead of ahead, appears to have triggered real descending signals, quieting the pain pathway from above, the same way a nurse's reassuring voice or a familiar hospital room might, in smaller, gentler ways, do something similar for a patient anticipating a routine procedure. So when researchers talk about placebo effects and pain in the same breath, this is the biology they're usually pointing toward, not a patient fooling themselves into ignoring an injury, but a patient's own nervous system, shaped by context, expectation, and the meaning of the moment, adjusting the dial on how strongly pain signals get amplified on their way to conscious experience. It's a real physiological event, involving real chemistry, real neural circuitry, real measurable changes, and it happens alongside the injury, not instead of it, more like a mixing board adjusting levels than a switch turning something off. It also helps explain why pain has always been such fertile ground for placebo research specifically, more so than, say, a broken bone's healing time or a tumor's growth rate, because pain is a perception assembled in real time, moment by moment, out of signals that context can genuinely influence, whereas the underlying tissue damage sits mostly outside that influence, indifferent to how threatened or reassured the mind happens to feel about it. And once you can hold both of those truths at once, that the injury is real and fixed, and that the felt experience of it is built, adjustable, responsive to context, a whole set of confusing old observations about doctors, rituals, and healing starts to look a little less mysterious, and a little more like ordinary biology, doing exactly what it evolved to do.
Let's slow down here and think about something almost everyone already knows without ever having studied it, which is what happens to a dog's mouth when a bell rings. Ivan Pavlov didn't set out to discover this. He was a physiologist in St. Petersburg at the turn of the 20th century, mostly interested in digestion, carefully measuring how much saliva dogs produced when given food, using a small surgical opening to collect it drop by drop. And somewhere in the tedium of that measuring, he noticed something that must have seemed almost like an error at first. His dogs had started salivating before the food arrived, not at the taste of meat powder on the tongue, but at the sound of the footsteps of the assistant who usually brought it. Their bodies were responding to a signal, a cue, a piece of context that had nothing nutritional in it at all, nothing that could be digested, and yet the salivary glands didn't seem to know that. They responded anyway, drop by drop, to a sound. What Pavlov eventually showed, through years of patient, almost obsessively careful experiments, was that this wasn't a fluke of one distracted dog. It was learnable. If you rang a bell every single time before presenting food, again and again, the same pairing repeated over many trials, the dog's body would eventually start responding to the bell alone, even on the occasions when no food followed it at all. The bell had become, in some very real physiological sense, a stand-in for the food. Not through any reasoning the dog performed, no decision, no belief in the way we usually use that word, just a nervous system, quietly learning that one thing reliably predicts another, and adjusting its automatic responses accordingly, in advance, before the predicted thing has even arrived. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to let the word conditioning slide past as something clinical, something that belongs only to laboratories, and dogs, and bells. But the same basic learning process, this quiet linking of a neutral cue to a bodily response, is happening constantly in ordinary human life, usually so gradually and so gently that nobody notices it happening at all. Think about the particular smell of a dentist's waiting room, that mix of antiseptic and carpet and something faintly medicinal, and how it can produce a small tightening in the shoulders before anyone has even sat down in the chair. Nothing painful has occurred yet. The smell itself does nothing to any nerve ending, but the smell has, over years of visits, become paired often enough with what follows it that the body starts bracing early, the way Pavlov's dogs started salivating early, simply because the pattern had been learned. Or think about coffee, and how for many people, the mere act of holding a warm mug and smelling that particular roasted bitterness can produce a small lift in alertness within seconds, long before any caffeine could possibly have been absorbed into the bloodstream and made its way to the brain. That's not the drug working yet. Caffeine takes something like 20 minutes to really begin exerting its effects. What's happening in those first seconds is closer to what happened with the bell, a cue, the smell and warmth and ritual of the cup, that has been paired so many hundreds or thousands of times with the eventual arrival of alertness that the body has started responding to the cue itself, a little in advance, a little on credit, the way it learned to expect the meat powder was coming. Caregivers seem to occupy a similar place in this kind of learning, especially early in life, and especially around comfort and pain. A small child who has been held and rocked and soothed by a particular parent hundreds of times during moments of distress can sometimes begin to calm down at the mere sight of that parent approaching, before any soothing has actually taken place, before the arms have even closed around them. The parent's face, their particular way of moving, their voice starting up in that particular gentling tone, all of it has become paired, through nothing more mysterious than repetition, with the physiological experience of calming down. And so the body starts to calm a little at the cue itself. anticipating what it has learned, quite reliably, tends to follow. Rooms seem to work this way too, which is part of why hospitals are such strange, layered places, emotionally speaking. A person who has had a difficult medical procedure in a particular kind of room, under particular fluorescent lighting, with a particular chemical smell in the air, may find that returning to a similar room, even for something entirely unrelated, produces a flicker of the same bodily state they associate with that earlier experience, a faster heartbeat, a tightening somewhere in the chest, sometimes even before they've consciously placed why the room feels the way it does. The room itself never touched them, but it was present, again and again perhaps, or even just once if the experience was intense enough, at the same time as something that did touch them, and the nervous system, ever efficient, ever pattern-hungry, filed the two together. Timing is one of the subtler threads in all of this, and it's worth pausing on, because it shows up in medicine in a very particular way. If a person takes a pill every morning at 8 o'clock, alongside a glass of water, in the same kitchen, before the same cup of tea, for months on end, the body doesn't only learn to expect whatever the pill's active ingredient does, it learns the whole scene, the time of day, the glass, the particular chair they sit in while swallowing it. Researchers studying this have found, in various careful experiments across the 20th century and into this one, that some physiological responses, changes in insulin release, in immune markers, in certain hormones, can become paired with these surrounding rituals almost as strongly as with the drug itself, so that going through the ritual alone, on a day when the pill inside the capsule has quietly been swapped for something inert, can still produce a measurable fraction of the expected bodily change. Not because the person is imagining it, and not because willpower is doing anything at all, but because the nervous system, and in some cases even the immune system, appears to have learned the pattern the way Pavlov's dogs learned the bell, and continues, faithfully, to respond to the cue. Taste belongs in this picture too, in a way that's almost more intimate than the others, because taste sits so close to memory. Bitterness in particular seems to carry a kind of built-in association for many people, a lifetime of bitter medicines having usually preceded feeling better, so that the bitter taste itself, entirely apart from whatever chemical produced it, can become a small signal to the body that relief is coming. This is part of why, in some placebo research, a bitter-tasting inert pill has been found to produce a slightly stronger response than a sweet or tasteless one of identical inert content. The bitterness isn't doing anything pharmacologically, but it's a cue the body has learned, over years of childhood cough syrups and grown-up prescriptions, to read as meaningful. What all of these small stories share, the bell, the coffee cup, the parent's face, the hospital room, the 8 o'clock ritual, the bitter taste, is the same underlying shape. A neutral cue gets paired, over and over, with something that produces a real bodily response. And eventually, the cue alone can call up a fragment of that response, even in the complete absence of the thing that originally caused it. This is not the body being tricked, exactly, and it's not the mind performing some act of belief either, not in the way we usually picture belief, as a conscious, effortful holding of an idea to be true. It looks much more like simple learning, the same kind of learning that lets a dog anticipate footsteps, happening quietly in tissues and pathways that never ask permission from conscious thought at all. And it's this exact mechanism, gentle, automatic, built from repetition, that turns out to be sitting underneath a surprising amount of what gets called the placebo effect,
waiting for us to look at it a little more closely.
Let's sit with a different way of looking at all this, one that doesn't replace the learning story we've just been following, but sits alongside it, offering another angle on the same soft, dim territory. Imagine, for a moment, that your brain isn't really a passive receiver of information from the body, patiently waiting for signals to arrive before deciding what to do with them. Imagine instead that it's something more like a weather forecaster, one who never stops working, constantly building a best guess about what's about to happen next, and then checking that guess against whatever comes in. This is one of the more useful frameworks that scientists and philosophers of mind have developed over the past few decades, usually called predictive processing, and it's worth saying clearly, in this quiet hour, that it's a framework, a way of organizing observations, not a finished, settled truth carved into stone. But it's a framework many careful researchers have found remarkably good at explaining things that otherwise seem strange. Here's the basic idea, laid out slowly. Your brain, sealed inside the dark, quiet vault of your skull, never directly experiences the world. It only ever receives signals, electrical and chemical, arriving through nerves, and it has to guess, constantly, what those signals mean. So instead of waiting passively for each new signal and figuring it out from scratch, which would be slow and metabolically expensive, the brain seems to run slightly ahead of the data. It builds a prediction, a kind of standing expectation about what the body's internal state probably is and what the world outside probably contains, based on everything it has learned before. Then, when actual signals come in, from your gut, your joints, your skin, your inner ear, the brain compares them to its prediction. If the signal matches what was expected, very little needs to change. The prediction was good. But if there's a mismatch, if the incoming signal says something different than what was anticipated, that gap has a name in this framework. It's called prediction error. And prediction error is, in a real sense, information. It tells the brain, gently, that its model of the world needs updating. Now here is where this becomes quietly relevant to everything we've been exploring about placebo responses. Because pain, in this view, is not simply a straightforward readout of tissue damage, a kind of internal Geiger counter clicking in exact proportion to how much harm has occurred. Pain is, at least in part, the brain's best guess, its prediction about how much protection the body currently needs. And that guess is built from many sources at once. It draws on the raw signals coming up from the tissue itself. Yes, the nerve endings, the inflammation, the actual physical state of things. But it also draws on context. It draws on memory. It draws on what happened last time something like this occurred. It draws on what a person has been told to expect. A twinge in the lower back feels very different, and this has been documented in careful studies, depending on whether a person believes it to be a muscle strain that will resolve in a few days, or a sign of something more serious happening in the spine. The tissue signal, in these comparisons, can be functionally identical, but the prediction wrapped around it is not, and the resulting experience of pain, which is always assembled somewhere upstream of the raw signal, can genuinely differ. This is a delicate point, and it deserves to be handled with some care, because it would be easy to hear this and think it means pain is somehow not real, that it's merely a story the brain tells itself, and that idea would be both wrong and, frankly, a little unkind to anyone who has ever hurt. The tissue damage, when it exists, is real. The prediction is also real, in the sense that it's a genuine computational process happening in genuine neural tissue, using real energy,
producing real, measurable downstream effects on muscle tension, on blood flow, on the release of the body's own pain-modulating chemicals. What changes is not whether something real is happening, but which real thing is doing more of the work in a given moment, the raw peripheral signal, or the brain's contextual guess about what that signal should mean. And under conditions of uncertainty, when a person genuinely doesn't know what's happening to them, or is afraid of what it might mean, the guessing process seems to lean harder on fear, and fear, in this framework, tends to sharpen prediction toward threat, toward the assumption that more protection is needed, which can, in turn, amplify the felt intensity of pain, sometimes considerably, without changing anything at all about the underlying tissue. Attention fits into this picture too, in a way that's easy to notice once it's pointed out, though it took researchers a long time to describe carefully. Think of attention as something like a spotlight, with a limited amount of light to give out. Whatever it lands on gets amplified, simply by virtue of being illuminated more brightly than everything around it, and whatever it moves away from tends to fade, not because it's gone, but because it's dim now, harder to make out clearly. A person lying awake at night, worried about a racing heartbeat, will often notice that heartbeat becoming more and more prominent in their awareness, not necessarily because the heart itself is beating any differently, but because the spotlight of attention has swung fully onto it, and stayed there, and every small sensation, under that much light, becomes harder to ignore. This is part of why distraction, something as simple as a story, or a familiar voice, or in your case, at this very moment, the sound of this narration, can measurably reduce the perceived intensity of a symptom. Not because the story fixes anything in the tissue, because the spotlight has moved, at least partway, somewhere else, and what remains in the dimmer light asks less of the nervous system's resources. Meaning belongs here as well, and this might be the gentlest thread of all to follow before sleep. The framework of predictive processing suggests that the brain isn't simply predicting sensations, it's predicting the significance of sensations, what they mean for safety, for the future, for how the day tomorrow, or the year ahead, is likely to go. Two people can experience what is, by any objective measure, a similar physical sensation, and carry away entirely different burdens from it, depending on what that sensation seems to signify. A sharp pain in the chest means something different to a person who has just finished a hard workout than it does to a person with a family history of heart trouble and no clear explanation for what they're feeling. The nerve signal might be nearly the same. The prediction wrapped around it, layered with memory, with fear, with stories half remembered from a worried relative, is not, and that difference in meaning can shape not only how frightening the sensation feels, but sometimes how the body itself continues to respond to it, since fear and its chemical companions, the sped-up heart, the shallow breath, the tightened muscle, tend to feed back into the very sensations they were reacting to in the first place, in a slow, quiet loop. It's worth pausing to say, clearly, and without hedging, that this predictive framework does not explain everything, and careful researchers would be the first to say so. It's one useful lens among several, valuable because it connects otherwise scattered observations, the power of context, the role of attention, the strange amplifying and softening effects of uncertainty, into something like a coherent shape. But it remains a model, refined and re-refined as new evidence comes in, not a final photograph of how the nervous system truly works underneath it all. What it offers, at its best, is not certainty, but a kind of permission to understand that a symptom can be shaped by expectation and attention, and meaning can grow larger or smaller depending on what the mind believes is happening. Without any of that meaning, the symptom was invented, or the suffering wasn't genuine, or the person experiencing it was in any way choosing how they felt. And it's this very distinction between a symptom being shaped and a symptom being fabricated that becomes especially important once we turn, as we will shortly, toward the boundary the placebo effect actually has, the conditions where expectation seems to matter enormously, and the different conditions, just as real, where it seems to matter barely at all.
Now let's turn toward the evidence itself, the part of the story that comes not from careful reasoning about prediction and expectation, but from machines, needles, and the slow, patient work of watching the living brain do something it wasn't supposed to be able to do on command. The story usually begins in the late 1970s, in a dental clinic connected to a research hospital, where a small group of scientists were investigating pain after wisdom tooth extraction, a reliable, if unpleasant, source of human discomfort for research purposes. Patients in pain were given a placebo, an inactive substance disguised as a painkiller, and some of them, as always happens, reported relief. Nothing unusual there. But then the researchers did something clever. They gave a second substance, quietly, without the patient's knowledge, a drug called naloxone, which does one very specific thing in the body. It blocks opioid receptors. It doesn't do much of anything else. It doesn't lower pain on its own, doesn't sedate, doesn't numb. Its entire job, chemically speaking, is to sit in the same receptor sites that opioid molecules would normally occupy and simply refuse to let them dock. And when naloxone was given to the patients whose pain had eased after the placebo, something remarkable happened. Their relief disappeared. Not entirely, not in every person, but in a strong enough pattern to matter. The placebo, which was chemically nothing, had apparently caused the body to release its own opioid-like molecules, endorphins, the brain's homemade morphine, and naloxone, by blocking the receptors those molecules would have used, effectively shut the relief back off. This was one of the first pieces of hard biochemical evidence that a placebo wasn't merely a story patients told themselves. It was a story that ended, somewhere along the way, in real molecules, doing real things, at real receptor sites. It's worth sitting with how strange this is, and letting the strangeness settle, rather than rushing past it. A person believes they are receiving a painkiller. They are not, but some part of the nervous system, operating well beneath conscious awareness, behaves as though the expectation itself were a kind of instruction, and manufactures the corresponding chemical response, borrowing from a pharmacy the body keeps within its own tissue. It's a little like a household that starts baking bread the moment it hears a delivery truck outside, before any flour has actually arrived, because the sound alone has, through years of experience, become linked tightly enough to the outcome that the body starts preparing early. The prediction runs ahead of the evidence. Brain imaging added another layer to this picture. Decades later, once positron emission tomography and functional magnetic resonance imaging became sensitive enough to watch these processes unfold in something close to real time. Researchers could now not only infer that opioids were involved through the naloxone experiments, but actually watch, on a scan, opioid activity increasing in particular regions of the brain when a person believed they were receiving pain relief, regions with names that don't matter nearly as much as their general role, areas involved in evaluating and dampening pain signals
as they travel upward from the site of injury toward conscious experience.
The scans showed activity rising in roughly the areas the biochemistry had already predicted it should, which is the kind of quiet, unglamorous confirmation that good science depends on far more than any single dramatic finding. Around the same period, a separate and equally careful body of work turned toward Parkinson's disease, a condition involving the loss of dopamine-producing neurons deep in the brain, and a condition where placebo responses have turned out to be unusually large and unusually well studied, partly because the underlying chemistry is so well understood. In these studies, patients were given a placebo they believed to be their regular Parkinson's medication, and researchers used imaging techniques capable of detecting dopamine release directly, and they found it. Real dopamine, released in meaningful amounts, in a brain that had not received the actual drug, simply because the patient expected that it had. But here is where the story gets more interesting, and more instructive, because it doesn't stop at a simple headline of belief causes dopamine release. Some of the most careful work in this area, much of it associated with researchers in Vancouver studying Parkinson's patients over many years, found that the size of this dopamine response depended heavily on context, on what the person had learned to expect from previous experience, on how reliably a treatment had worked for them before, on the specific ritual and setting surrounding the moment of receiving it. A patient who had a long history of good responses to their real medication, taken in a particular clinical setting, tended to show a larger placebo dopamine release than someone without that conditioning history. The brain, in other words, wasn't simply producing a generic reward chemical because someone said the word medicine. It was drawing on a specific, individually shaped set of associations, built through real prior experience, and using that history to calibrate how much dopamine made sense to release in this particular moment. Expectation, once again, turns out to be less like a single switch and more like a finely tuned prediction, sensitive to a great deal of accumulated context. Now, it would be easy, hearing all of this, to walk away with the impression that brain scans have somehow proven exactly what the placebo effect is, mechanistically, down to the last detail, the way a mechanic might trace a rattling noise to one specific loose bolt. That impression, however tempting, would go further than the evidence actually supports, and it's worth slowing down here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that tends to get flattened into something simpler and more confident once it leaves the research paper and enters a headline. Brain imaging is a remarkable tool, but it has real limits, and honest researchers are careful, almost fussy, about stating them. A scan can show that a region became more active, or that a particular neurotransmitter was released in greater quantities, but activity in a brain region rarely maps cleanly onto a single, simple function, the way a light turning on in one room of a house tells you someone is there, but not what they're doing, or why. The regions involved in placebo responses tend to be the same regions involved in a wide range of other processes: attention, emotion, the anticipation of reward. So an increase in activity is a clue, a piece of a larger argument, not a definitive translation of what the mind is experiencing. Two studies can report activity in what looks like the same general area and still be capturing meaningfully different things, depending on the precise task, the population studied, and the exact analysis applied to admittedly noisy data. There's also the matter of sample size, and here, it helps to imagine the difference between a small neighborhood bakery
testing a new recipe on a dozen regular customers, and a national chain testing it across hundreds of stores in different cities.
Many early placebo imaging studies, including some of the most frequently cited ones, involved relatively small numbers of participants, a reasonable and often necessary choice given the cost and complexity of this kind of research, but one that means any single finding deserves to be treated as an interesting data point awaiting confirmation rather than a settled fact ready for a textbook. Some findings have held up well across replication. Others have turned out to be more fragile, more dependent on the specific conditions of the original study than researchers initially realized, and this unevenness is not a flaw in the science so much as an honest description of how science, especially science of something as layered as human expectation, actually tends to proceed. So the fair summary, the one that respects both the excitement of these findings and their genuine limits, sounds something like this. There is now real, repeated, biochemical evidence that placebo responses involve measurable changes in the brain and body, endogenous opioids in the case of pain, dopamine in the case of Parkinson's, and other systems in other conditions still being mapped out. These are not imagined effects, dressed up in scientific language. But knowing that a chemical was released is not the same as knowing precisely how belief triggers its release, or why some brains and some situations produce a much larger response than others, or how far this mechanism extends into conditions where the underlying biology is less well understood. The honest picture is one of real mechanism, partially glimpsed, still being carefully filled in, and it's that partial, evolving picture that leads naturally into a question researchers have spent just as much careful effort trying to answer. Not merely whether the placebo effect is real, but where, precisely, its reach begins to run out. Let's set that question aside for a moment and turn to something more tangible, something you could almost hold in your hand. Because if belief can trigger real chemical release, then the shape, color, and price of a treatment ritual becomes more than packaging. It becomes part of the medicine, or at least part of what the brain is using to calculate its response. Start with something as small as a capsule versus a tablet. In several studies comparing identical inert substances delivered in different physical forms, capsules have tended to outperform tablets for certain symptoms, particularly pain and anxiety. Nobody is entirely sure why, though there are reasonable guesses. A capsule looks more engineered, somehow more medical, more like something a chemist assembled rather than something pressed out of powder. It has a faint clinical gloss to it, a plastic sheen that reads, to some deep and mostly unconscious part of the mind, as more potent, and color carries its own quiet vocabulary. Across a number of trials, researchers have found that red, yellow, and orange pills tend to be associated with stimulant effects, while blue and green pills tend to be associated with calming or sedative effects, a pattern so consistent that some researchers have wondered whether it reflects cultural associations built up over decades of drug marketing, red for energy, blue for tranquility, the way a stop sign and a cloudless sky have trained the eye long before anyone reads a label. Interestingly, this color association appears to shift somewhat across cultures, suggesting it's learned rather than hardwired, a kind of visual dialect rather than a universal grammar. Then there's number and dose. 2 pills have, in some studies, produced a stronger placebo response
then one pill of the same inert substance, as though the body is quietly tallying evidence. More capsules, more input, more reason to expect something is happening. And the ritual of taking a pill at all outperforms simply being told to expect an effect without any object to hold. There is something about the physical act, the swallowing, the small effort and the water, and the moment of pause, that seems to matter on its own, separate from any belief about the ingredients inside. Route of administration follows a similar pattern, and this is where things get a little more consequential, a little more worth sitting with. An injection, in study after study, produces a stronger placebo response than a pill delivering the same inert substance. A saline injection, salt water and nothing more, has outperformed a sugar pill for pain relief in several head-to-head comparisons.
This makes a certain intuitive sense once you think about what an injection represents in the shared cultural imagination. It is more invasive, which the mind seems to read, fairly or not, as more serious, more targeted, more likely to work quickly because it bypasses the slow business of digestion and goes straight into the bloodstream. There's a small irony worth noticing here, that the very quality making an injection feel more powerful, its invasiveness, is also what makes it carry more risk of infection, more discomfort, more cost to deliver. The ritual that impresses the mind most is not the ritual with the best safety profile, which means the pull toward a more dramatic intervention doesn't answer the question of what a patient actually needs. It answers a different question entirely, about what feels convincing. Surgery sits at the far end of this scale, and here the evidence becomes genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, in a way that's worth turning over slowly rather than rushing past. A handful of studies, conducted decades apart and in different countries, have compared real surgical procedures against sham surgery, where patients were anesthetized, an incision was made, and then the surgeon closed the wound again without performing the actual procedure being tested. In one well-known set of trials, examining a common knee procedure for osteoarthritis, patients who received the sham surgery reported pain relief and functional improvement that was statistically indistinguishable from patients who received the real procedure, both groups improving and neither group knowing which one they'd gotten until the study was unblinded. This doesn't mean surgery is fake or that surgeons are performing empty theater. It means that for certain conditions, the ritual weight of the operating room, the anesthesia, the incision, the waking up afterward with a bandage and a story to tell, may be doing more of the work than researchers had assumed, work that then sits alongside and sometimes gets mistaken for the work of the procedure itself. Price carries a similar and equally uncomfortable weight. In one frequently discussed study, participants were given what they were told was a new pain medication, actually an inert saline solution, and were informed either that it cost about $10 a dose or $2.50 a dose. The people told they'd received the more expensive version reported significantly greater pain relief after a mild electric shock, despite receiving the exact same substance as the other group. The brain, it seems, treats price as information, a shorthand for quality in a world where a shopper often can't fully evaluate a product on its own merits and falls back on cost as a proxy. The same instinct that makes a bottle of wine taste better to most drinkers when they're told it's expensive, even when it's the identical wine poured from the identical bottle, a phenomenon researchers have also captured on brain scans, watching activity change in reward-related regions based on price alone, with no difference in the wine itself. None of this means expensive treatments are always placebo,
or that cheap treatments are secretly just as effective and everyone's being fooled. Many expensive treatments work through entirely real, well-documented biological mechanisms that have nothing to do with price psychology. What it means is that price is never a neutral fact sitting outside the treatment experience. It gets folded into expectation, and expectation gets folded into outcome, in ways that are difficult to fully separate even in careful research, and nearly impossible to separate in the middle of an ordinary doctor's visit. The clinician delivering the treatment matters just as much as the treatment's physical form, maybe more. A cold, hurried explanation and a warm, attentive one, tested against the exact same inert treatment, have produced measurably different results. In one classic study involving patients with irritable bowel syndrome, those who received sham acupuncture from a practitioner who was warm spent extra time with them, expressed confidence, and offered a thoughtful explanation of what to expect, showed significantly greater symptom improvement than those who received the identical sham treatment delivered briskly and without that warmth. The needles were the same, or rather, the fake needles were the same, retractable devices that never broke the skin. The only variable was the humanness of the encounter, and confident language appears to matter independently of warmth. A doctor who says, "This will help you," in a steady, unhurried voice, tends to produce a stronger response than one who says, "This might help." Some patients find it useful, even when both doctors are prescribing the same thing for the same condition. There's an old, possibly apocryphal, but widely repeated observation from clinical medicine that the physician's own belief in a treatment seems to leak into the patient's experience of it somehow, through tone, through posture, through the thousand small unconscious cues that make up a bedside manner, in ways that are hard to script and harder still to fake convincingly.
But here is the part worth resting on before moving further, because it's easy to hear all of this and draw the wrong lesson from it. None of this means more dramatic is automatically better, or that a patient seeking care should hope for injections over pills, sham surgery-style theater over a straightforward conversation, or a doctor who oversells rather than one who's simply honest and kind. Effects vary enormously by symptom, and this is one of the most important qualifiers in the entire field. Placebo responses tend to be largest for subjective symptoms: pain, nausea, fatigue, mood, the kinds of experiences the brain itself is directly involved in generating and can therefore modulate. They tend to be far smaller, often negligible, for symptoms with a more purely mechanical basis: a broken bone's healing time, a tumor's actual size, a bacterial infection's underlying cause. A confident tone and a red capsule will not shrink a tumor or set a fracture, however comforting the ritual feels in the room. Which raises a natural, quieter question, one worth carrying gently into the next stretch of this explanation. If these effects are real, but bounded, concentrated in certain kinds of symptoms, and stubbornly absent in others, what exactly determines where that boundary sits? Now, let's set that boundary question aside for a moment, because there's a strange detour in this story that seems to break one of the rules we just laid out, and it's worth sitting with slowly, the way you'd turn over a smooth stone you found somewhere unexpected. Everything so far has assumed a kind of hidden machinery. The patient believes the pill is medicine. The belief, mistaken or not, does something. The deception, gentle as it usually is in a research setting, seems to be a necessary ingredient, the way yeast seems necessary for bread to rise. So what happens if you take the deception away entirely? What happens if you hand someone a bottle, plainly labeled, in plain language, placebo pills, containing no medication, and tell them exactly that, and they take the pills anyway, knowing full well there is nothing pharmacologically active inside? This sounds, on first hearing, like it shouldn't work at all. If the story we've been telling is correct, if belief in the treatment is the engine, then removing the belief should remove the effect, cleanly, the way removing a battery stops a flashlight. And yet, starting in the early 2000s, a small number of researchers began testing exactly this, calling it open-label placebo, and the results, while far from a settled matter, turned out to be strange enough that they're still being argued over today. One of the earlier and more widely discussed studies came out of Harvard, led by a researcher named Ted Kapchuk, who has spent much of his career specifically on placebo mechanisms rather than dismissing them as noise to be subtracted out of other experiments. In the study, people with irritable bowel syndrome, a condition marked by cramping, bloating, and unpredictable digestive discomfort, were split into two groups. One group received no new treatment at all, simply continued whatever care they'd already been getting. The other group was given pills in bottles that said, in plain print, placebo pills, and the participants were also told, verbally, in some detail, that placebo pills have been shown in clinical studies to produce significant improvement in irritable bowel syndrome symptoms through mind-body self-healing processes. They were told this was true. They were told there was nothing in the pills, and they were asked to take them anyway, twice a day. The open-label group reported meaningfully greater symptom relief than the group that received nothing. Not everyone, not dramatically, and not in a way that erased their condition, but enough of a difference that it caught the attention of people well outside the small community that studies placebos for a living. It was, on its face, a genuinely odd result. You cannot trick someone who already knows the trick. So the explanations that followed tend to fall into a few different families, and it's worth walking through them slowly, because none of them, on its own, feels fully sufficient, which is itself part of what makes this area of the science feel unfinished rather than settled. One explanation leans on ritual itself, separate from belief in hidden ingredients. The act of taking a pill twice a day, at set times, with some care and attention, may function a little like other health rituals that don't require any particular metaphysical belief to have an effect on how a body regulates itself. The way a regular bedtime routine can improve sleep, somewhat independent of what specifically happens within that routine, or the way the simple structure of showing up to a gym at the same hour each day seems to matter almost as much as what happens once you're there. Under this view, it isn't that the person is fooled, it's that the behavior itself, the noticing, the pausing, the small daily act of attending to one's own body, is doing part of the work. A second explanation focuses on what participants were actually told, which was not neutral. They weren't just handed an empty pill and left to wonder. They were given a specific piece of information that placebos have been shown to help with this condition through mechanisms involving the body's own regulatory systems. That is itself a kind of expectation-setting statement delivered by a credentialed researcher in a context that carries its own authority.
So in a sense, open-label placebo studies may not remove belief so much as relocate it, shifting it away from belief in a fake drug and toward belief in a real, if broad and somewhat vague, claim about the body's own capacities. The pill becomes less a chemical and more a kind of appointment with that belief, a physical object that gives the abstract idea somewhere to land twice a day. A third explanation is gentler and more mundane, and probably deserves more weight than it often gets, which is simply the effect of care and attention themselves. People in these studies are, by definition, enrolled in something. They are checked in on. Someone is monitoring their symptoms, asking how they're doing, treating their discomfort as worth studying. That alone, separate from any pill, tends to modestly improve how people report feeling, a pattern researchers sometimes call the effect of being observed, related to, though not identical with, an old idea from workplace studies about how simply being watched changes behavior. It's difficult, in most open-label placebo designs, to fully separate the pill-taking from this surrounding warmth of attention, and few of the studies were built with a design capable of teasing the two apart cleanly. And then there is a fourth possibility, less flattering to the field, which is simply that many of these studies have been small. Some involved several dozen participants, occasionally fewer. Small samples are noisier by nature, prone to producing results that look striking, but don't hold up when a much larger group is tested, purely as a matter of statistics rather than biology. A coin flipped 10 times can land heads, 8 of those times, without the coin being unfair in any way, and early placebo research in general, going back decades, has a documented history of effects that looked robust in a first small trial and then shrank, sometimes considerably, when other researchers tried to reproduce the work with more people and tighter controls.
Open-label placebo research is still working through that same maturing process, and reviews attempting to combine the results of many small studies have found effects that are real but modest and considerably less dramatic than the more widely shared, more quotable, individual results might suggest on their own. None of this means the open-label finding is false. It means it's early, and it means it's probably several things at once, rather than one clean mechanism with a tidy explanation, which, if you've been following this story so far, should sound familiar, because that's been true of almost everything discussed about placebos up to this point. But there is one thing about open-label placebo that stands apart from everything else in this account, and it isn't about the size of the effect at all. It's about the ethics underneath it. Traditional placebo use in clinical practice, outside of research settings, has always carried an uncomfortable shadow, because it typically requires some degree of deception, a doctor implying, or outright stating, that an inert treatment is active, which sits awkwardly, to put it mildly, against the basic expectation that a doctor tells a patient the truth about what's in the bottle. Open-label placebo sidesteps that discomfort almost entirely. No one is misled. No trust is placed on loan against a lie that will eventually need to be either maintained or confessed. The patient knows precisely what they're taking, and takes it anyway, as a kind of informed, willing participant in whatever is happening between mind and body, rather than an unwitting subject of it. That distinction between effects that require secrecy and effects that apparently don't, at least not entirely, has quietly reshaped how many researchers now think about the ethics of the whole field, separate from any question about how large or reliable the benefit turns out to be
once the bigger, better designed trials are finished. It suggests, tentatively, that whatever the placebo response actually is, it may not depend on being fooled in the way it was long assumed to, which is a strange thing to discover about the mind, and a good place to let it settle for now, before turning to the ways this same phenomenon can, under different circumstances, work quietly in reverse.
Let the mind rest there a moment, with the idea that belief doesn't need deception to do its work, because now it's time to look at what happens when belief turns the other direction. There's a mirror image to everything discussed so far, and it deserves the same slow, careful attention, because it involves the same machinery, running the same circuits, just pointed toward harm instead of relief. Researchers call it the nocebo effect, from the Latin for "I shall harm," a term coined almost as an afterthought, decades after the word placebo had already settled into medical vocabulary. And once you understand it, you start noticing it everywhere, in places that might once have seemed unrelated. Picture a very ordinary moment in a doctor's office. A physician hands over a prescription, and somewhere in the conversation, almost as a formality, comes the list of possible side effects: nausea, headache, fatigue, dizziness. The physician isn't lying. Every item on that list has been documented somewhere, in some trial, in some patient. The disclosure is honest, thorough, exactly what medical ethics and informed consent require. And yet, in study after study, patients who hear that list are measurably more likely to experience those very symptoms than patients given the same pill without being told what to expect. Not because the pill changed, because the expectation did. This isn't a small or marginal effect either. In one often cited demonstration involving beta blocker medication for heart conditions, patients were divided into 3 groups. One group was told nothing about the drug at all. A second group was told they were receiving a medication without further detail. A third group was told specifically that the drug might cause erectile dysfunction, which was, again, a documented and real possible side effect, nothing invented. The rate of reported erectile dysfunction rose sharply with each step of disclosure, roughly doubling in the fully informed group compared to the uninformed one. Same chemical compound, same dose, different sentence spoken in the exam room beforehand, and a different body's worth of symptoms afterward. It would be easy to hear that and think the lesson is to simply say less, to keep patients in the dark for their own comfort, but that conclusion runs headfirst into everything medicine has spent the last century trying to build, which is a system where patients understand what's being done to them and consent to it freely, with real information, not curated reassurance. So, the nocebo effect doesn't hand doctors permission to withhold anything. It hands them a much harder problem, which is how to tell the truth without accidentally manufacturing the very symptoms the truth describes. Some of this seems to trace back to something almost embarrassingly simple, which is attention. Once a person has been told to watch for dizziness, they start paying closer attention to their own sense of balance, to that faint wobble that a body produces constantly and normally ignores, a little unsteadiness on standing up too quickly, which happens to almost everyone, almost every day, and usually passes unnoticed, suddenly gets flagged, examined, and filed under side effect, when a week earlier it would have simply been filed under nothing at all, background noise beneath the threshold of conscious concern. The body hasn't necessarily changed. The lens has.
But attention alone doesn't explain everything researchers have observed, because nocebo responses can also involve real, measurable physiological changes, not just noticing symptoms that were already there, but genuinely amplifying them or generating new ones. Anxiety itself produces its own actual bodily sensations: the tight chest, the shallow breath, the faint nausea of worry, and if a person has just been told a pill might make them feel unwell, some portion of what follows may be the direct bodily signature of that worry, dressed up and misread as a drug reaction, because the timing lines up so neatly with the timing of the pill.
There's also a quieter mechanism at work, built entirely from memory. If someone has taken a similar medication before and felt sick from it, whether from the drug itself or from something else entirely happening in their life that week, that memory doesn't stay filed away neutrally. It becomes a kind of template the brain reaches for the next time a similar pill, a similar bottle, even a similar smell or shape of tablet appears. Classical conditioning, the same basic learning process famously described with Pavlov's dogs salivating at a bell, seems to apply here too, quietly, without any conscious decision involved. The body learned, once, that this kind of event is followed by that kind of feeling, and it doesn't require permission to apply that lesson again. And then there's a layer that has nothing to do with any individual person's own history at all, which is what happens when illness, or the appearance of illness, moves through a group of people who can see and hear one another. This has a long and genuinely strange documented history. Outbreaks of unexplained symptoms, fainting, nausea, headaches, dizziness, have occurred in schools, factories, and offices, sometimes spreading through a room in a matter of hours, with no toxin, no contamination, no infectious agent ever found despite exhaustive investigation. What investigators do find, again and again, is a plausible trigger, an unusual smell, a rumor of a gas leak, one visibly ill classmate or coworker, followed by a wave of others reporting the same sensations, spreading not through the air, but seemingly through observation itself, through the simple, deeply human act of watching someone else react, and unconsciously checking your own body against theirs. Researchers sometimes call this mass psychogenic illness, and while it remains a genuinely debated and complicated phenomenon, one that deserves far more care than treating it as simply all in people's heads, it does illustrate, in a dramatic form, something that happens in much smaller, quieter ways constantly. Expectation is contagious. Watching someone wince can make your own stomach tighten before you've even asked why. Language itself carries more of this weight than most people realize, and small differences in phrasing appear to matter more than intuition would suggest. There's a persistent thread of research suggesting that asking a patient, "Does this hurt?" during a procedure can prime more reported pain than asking something like, "How are you feeling right now?" or offering no prompt at all, presumably because the word itself hands the mind a category to sort sensation into, a slot that neutral sensation might otherwise never have been placed in. Anesthesiologists in some settings have experimented with deliberately softened language during procedures, replacing "you'll feel a big sting now" with something closer to "you'll feel a small pinch," like a mosquito, and found modest but real differences in how much discomfort patients later reported, even though the needle, the depth, the drug, everything physical about the moment stayed exactly the same. None of this is an argument for softening the truth into something false, and it's worth sitting with that distinction for a moment, because it's easy to blur.
Ethical risk communication was never supposed to mean saying whatever produces the calmest patient. It means finding language that is completely accurate and also doesn't do more suggestive work than the facts themselves require. A doctor can say a medication commonly causes mild, temporary nausea in some patients without describing it as a near certainty, without dwelling on it longer than its actual likelihood warrants, without repeating it 3 times in slightly different words for emphasis. The information stays whole, only the emotional weight placed on top of it changes. Some hospitals and researchers have started applying this directly, with a framework sometimes called contextualized informed consent, where patients are still told everything they're legally and ethically owed, but where the framing leans toward describing the range of likely experience rather than front-loading the most frightening possibility as though it were the probable one. Telling a patient that most people find a procedure uncomfortable but manageable is not a lie if that happens to be statistically true, even if it's also true that a smaller number of people find it quite painful. Leading with the average experience rather than the worst documented case turns out to shift outcomes measurably in trial after trial without removing a single fact from the conversation. There's something almost delicate about this, once you sit with it long enough, the idea that the exact same true sentence, spoken 2 different ways, can leave 2 different bodies in 2 different states by morning. It suggests that honesty and kindness were never actually in tension, the way people sometimes assume, that telling someone the whole truth and telling it gently were never mutually exclusive goals competing for the same sentence. It also raises a quieter, more unsettling question, one worth carrying gently into the next part of this account, which is what happens when this same expectation-driven amplification isn't happening in a doctor's office at all, but simply in the ordinary, unremarkable worry a person carries alone into their own bed at night.
Let's move now into a different room entirely, away from bedsides and consultation rooms, and into the quiet machinery of the clinical trial itself, because this is where a lot of the confusion about placebo actually gets manufactured, often by accident, often by people who know better, but are still fooled by their own data. Picture a trial testing a new pill for chronic lower back pain. 200 people enroll. Half get the real drug, half get a sugar pill, and after 8 weeks, both groups report improvement. The people running the trial are pleased, cautiously, because this is expected. But here is the detail that gets lost in casual retellings of placebo research, the detail that takes some patience to really absorb. Some meaningful portion of that improvement in both groups would very likely have happened even if nobody had taken anything at all. This is called natural history, and it is one of the least glamorous, most important facts in all of medicine. Most conditions that bring people into a doctor's office are not static. They rise and fall. A bad back has good weeks and bad weeks. A skin rash flares and settles. Even something as serious as depression tends to ebb, cycling through periods of heaviness and periods of relative lightness, often for reasons nobody can fully explain, tied loosely to sleep, season, stress, hormones, 100 threads too tangled to trace. So if you take 100 people with chronic pain and simply do nothing to them, wait 8 weeks, and ask how they're feeling, a good number will say they feel somewhat better. Not because anything treated them, just because that is the ordinary rhythm of how bodies move through time. Layered on top of natural history is something with an even drier name, regression to the mean, and it deserves a slow, careful unpacking because it is probably the single most underappreciated force behind apparent medical improvement. Here's the shape of it. People tend to seek treatment, or enroll in a trial, or ask for a new pill, precisely when they feel their worst. Nobody calls their doctor on a good day. Nobody signs up for a clinical trial the week their symptoms happen to be mild. So the starting point of almost every trial, almost every doctor's visit, is a kind of local peak of suffering, a temporary high point on a wavy line that naturally has both high points and low points. And what happens after a peak, on almost any wavy line, whether it's pain, blood pressure, mood, or something as mundane as a golfer's score on an unusually bad day, it tends to drift back toward the middle, not because of intervention, just because of arithmetic, because extreme values are followed, on average, by less extreme ones. Put those two things together, natural history and regression to the mean, and you start to see why a person can take a completely inert sugar pill, feel better a month later, and be entirely sincere in crediting the pill, without the pill having done a single physiological thing beyond dissolving in their stomach. The improvement is real. Their pain really did go down. But the pill, in that particular case, may have been a bystander to a process already in motion, arriving just before a low tide that was coming anyway. Now, this doesn't mean placebo effects aren't real, and it's worth being careful here, because the two ideas get mashed together constantly in casual conversation. Researchers spend a great deal of effort trying to separate what's sometimes called the true placebo response, meaning a measurable physiological or psychological change caused by expectation and context, from what's simply the natural course of the illness reasserting itself. The way they try to do this is by adding a third arm to a trial alongside the drug group and the placebo group, a group that receives no treatment at all, sometimes called a waiting list or natural history control. If the no treatment group also improves nearly as much as the placebo group, that's a signal that a good portion of what looked like a placebo effect was really just time doing what time does. If the placebo group improves noticeably more than the untreated group, that gap, that difference, is closer to what researchers mean by a genuine placebo response, something attributable to the ritual of treatment itself rather than to the simple passage of weeks. This is delicate work, and it isn't done as often as it should be, because three-armed trials are more expensive and more complicated to run than two-armed ones, so a great deal of the placebo research reported in the news, the headlines about sugar pills relieving pain or fatigue or anxiety, comes from studies that never fully separated true placebo response from ordinary natural history. It's not that the researchers are being careless. It's that isolating one thread from a tangle of overlapping causes is genuinely difficult, and the tools for doing it cleanly are newer and less common than most people assume. There's another quiet source of confusion sitting inside these numbers, and it has to do with what actually gets reported, both by patients and by the studies that publish results. This is sometimes called reporting bias, and it shows up in small, human ways. A person who signs up for a trial, takes a pill twice a day for 2 months, and shows up for follow-up visits has made an investment of time, of hope, sometimes of real inconvenience, and there is a gentle, mostly unconscious pull toward describing that investment as having been worth it. Not lying, exactly, just a soft rounding in the retelling toward improvement, especially when a friendly research coordinator is sitting across the table
asking how things have been going. Meanwhile, people whose symptoms didn't budge or worsened sometimes simply stop showing up. They drop out of the trial. Their absence is itself a kind of data, but a kind that's easy to undercount, because a trial's final results often lean most heavily on the people who stuck around to the end, who tend, for reasons that have nothing to do with the drug, to be the people who were doing at least somewhat better all along. Adherence complicates the picture further, in a way that sounds almost too simple to matter, until you look closely. In many trials, people who take their pills reliably, whether the pill is the real drug or the placebo, tend to have better outcomes than people who skip doses erratically. This has been documented again and again, and it's a strange finding to sit with, because it means that simply being the kind of person who follows a routine, who takes a tablet every morning with breakfast without fail, is itself correlated with getting better, independent of what's inside the tablet. Some of this is likely about general health behavior. The same reliability that gets someone to take their pills on schedule might also get them to sleep more regularly, eat a bit better, show up to their follow-up appointments. But some researchers suspect the ritual of adherence itself, the small daily act of caretaking, carries its own quiet weight, separate from anything pharmacological. And then there's blinding, which sounds like a straightforward safeguard, and turns out to be surprisingly leaky in practice. The entire logic of a placebo-controlled trial depends on nobody, not the patient, not the doctor administering treatment, knowing who received the real drug and who received the inert one. But real drugs often have side effects: a dry mouth, a faint tremor, a metallic taste, and inert sugar pills usually don't. So it isn't unusual, partway through a trial, for patients to start noticing these small physical signatures and quietly guessing which group they're in. Studies that have actually asked participants to guess, at the end of a trial, whether they received the drug or the placebo, have found that people guess correctly far more often than chance would predict. And that guess matters, because believing you got the real treatment tends to produce a stronger placebo response than believing you got the dummy pill, which means an imperfectly blinded trial can inflate its own placebo numbers without anyone intending to cheat.
Put all of these threads together: natural history, regression to the mean, reporting bias, adherence effects, and blinding failures, and you start to see why a simple question like, "Does this pill work?" resists a simple answer. Improvement after treatment is never a single clean signal. It's a braid of several different forces, pulling in roughly the same direction, and untangling which strand did how much of the work is some of the most patient, unglamorous science that exists, the kind that rarely makes headlines because it mostly produces careful uncertainty rather than dramatic claims. It's worth sitting with that uncertainty for a moment, because it sets up something even stranger, waiting just ahead, a set of findings that seem, on the surface, to break the rules of everything discussed so far. So let's set some boundaries, gently, because this is the part where the story of the placebo effect could easily get away from us if we let it. Everything discussed so far has been real. The dopamine released in a Parkinson's patient's brain when they believe a sham surgery might help them move more easily, the measurable drop in perceived pain when someone thinks they've received an analgesic, the way expectation can genuinely recruit the body's own pain relief machinery, its endogenous opioids, its cannabinoid system, its whole quiet pharmacy of internally produced chemicals. None of that is imaginary. None of that is a trick of the mind in the dismissive sense, the sense that implies nothing actually happened. Something did happen. Brains changed their chemistry. Nervous systems altered how they processed and reported sensation. That much has been documented carefully, in lab after lab, by researchers who were often trying quite hard to prove there was nothing there, and kept finding that there was. But here's where a person listening late at night, half in and half out of sleep, might start to let the idea drift somewhere it shouldn't go. If belief can change chemistry, if expectation can quiet pain, if context can shift the felt experience of illness, does that mean belief alone can shrink a tumor? Does it mean the right attitude can clear a bacterial infection? Does it mean that showing up to a car accident with enough calm conviction could replace what a trauma surgeon does with their hands? The honest answer, the answer that the actual research supports, is no. And it's worth sitting with why the answer is no, because the reasons are almost more interesting than a simple yes would have been. Start with pain, since pain is where the placebo effect has its clearest, best documented territory. Pain is, in a very real sense, partly a construction, not fake, not imaginary, but built, moment to moment, by a nervous system that takes raw signals from damaged tissue and combines them with attention, expectation, mood, memory, and context before producing the felt experience we call hurting. Because pain is built this way, it has genuine room to be modulated by belief. The volume knob is real. Expectation can turn it down, sometimes by a noticeable amount, sometimes enough to matter clinically. Now think about a tumor. A tumor is not a construction of the nervous system. It is a physical mass, a population of cells that have stopped obeying the normal rules of division and death, sitting in tissue, taking up space, sometimes pressing on nerves or organs, sometimes releasing substances into the bloodstream. Whether that tumor grows, shrinks, or stays the same size depends on cellular biology, on blood supply, on the immune system's ability to recognize and attack abnormal cells, on the specific mutations driving that particular cancer's growth. A person's beliefs about their prognosis do not reach down into that tissue and instruct individual cells to stop dividing. There is no known biological pathway by which optimism, on its own, causes malignant cells to die in meaningful numbers. Researchers have looked for this. It would be an extraordinary finding if it were true, and extraordinary findings get looked for very hard. What they've found instead is something more modest and, honestly, still worth knowing. Attitude and psychological state can influence how well a person tolerates treatment, how consistently they show up for chemotherapy sessions, how their immune and stress systems function in ways that might make some infections or complications less likely. Those are real and useful effects. They are not the same as belief curing cancer, and conflating the two has caused real harm, sometimes convincing people to delay or refuse effective treatment in favor of pursuing certainty and calm alone. The same logic applies to infection. A bacterial infection is a population of living organisms multiplying somewhere in the body, doing damage as they go. The immune system does have some capacity to fight them, and stress hormones can measurably suppress immune function, so it's not absurd to imagine that a calmer, less stressed patient might mount a slightly more effective immune response than a panicked one. That's a plausible, modest effect, and there's some evidence for pieces of it. But a serious bacterial infection, the kind that causes a raging fever or spreads into the bloodstream, needs antibiotics that can reach the bacteria and disrupt their cell walls or their protein synthesis directly.
No amount of calm confidence disrupts a bacterial cell wall. The belief that you'll get better doesn't manufacture penicillin. It might make the days waiting for the antibiotics to work feel less miserable. It will not do the antibiotics' job. Emergency medicine draws perhaps the clearest line of all. If someone is bleeding heavily, if an airway is blocked, if a heart has stopped its rhythm, no expectation, no ritual, no comforting belief changes the physics or chemistry of what's happening in those moments. A severed artery needs pressure and, eventually, a surgeon's hands. A blocked airway needs to be physically cleared. A heart in the wrong rhythm sometimes needs an electric shock to reset it, a jolt of current interrupting the chaotic electrical signal and giving the heart's natural pacemaker a chance to take back control. These are mechanical, chemical, electrical interventions acting on a body that in that moment is not in a position to be talked into healing itself.
This is precisely why every placebo-controlled trial in medical history has taken place around treatments for things like pain, nausea, mild depression, irritable bowel symptoms, and never around treatments for a ruptured appendix or a compound fracture. Nobody runs a trial testing whether a sugar pill can substitute for setting a broken bone, because the bone will not reduce itself no matter what anyone in the room believes. There would be nothing to measure except how quickly the untreated bone gets worse. There's a subtler danger here too, one that has less to do with individual biology and more to do with how illness gets talked about, sometimes with the kindest of intentions. Somewhere in the last century, a way of speaking took hold that treated illness, especially serious illness, as partly a referendum on someone's inner strength or positivity. You'll hear it in phrases like fighting cancer, or battling depression, or the idea that a patient with the right mindset can beat the odds. There's comfort in that framing for some people, a sense of agency in circumstances that otherwise feel entirely out of their hands, but it carries a quieter cost. If recovery is framed as a matter of attitude, then a person whose disease progresses despite their best efforts can end up feeling, unfairly, that they simply didn't believe hard enough, didn't fight well enough, as though their own mind had failed them on top of everything else their body was already going through. So that's a heavy, unearned weight to hand someone who is already carrying enough. The biology of most serious disease unfolds according to mechanisms that have very little to do with the patient's outlook, and preserving that truth, gently, is itself a form of kindness. So where does that leave the placebo effect once these boundaries are drawn? It leaves it exactly where the careful research has always placed it, as a real, measurable, sometimes clinically useful phenomenon that operates most powerfully on the subjective, symptom reporting side of illness, on pain, nausea, fatigue, mood, the felt experience of a condition, and on certain physiological systems that are directly wired to expectation and stress, like some aspects of immune signaling and the release of the body's own pain-relieving chemicals. It is not a general-purpose healing force capable of reaching into any tissue and rewriting its fate. The nervous system has genuine influence over some things and essentially none over others, and the line between those two categories isn't drawn by how much someone wants it to be otherwise, it's drawn by anatomy, by what's actually connected to what. Which is, in its own way, a comforting shape for the whole idea to take. It means the placebo effect doesn't need to be either dismissed as nothing or inflated into a miracle to be worth taking seriously. It can simply be what it is, a real and fascinating example of the mind and body talking to each other more closely than most people assume.
operating within limits that make it something to understand rather than something to lean on in place of medicine that actually reaches the problem. And once those limits are clear, it becomes possible to look at some of the strangest findings in this whole field, the ones that seem to test the very edges of what expectation can do, without mistaking strangeness for magic.
There's still a question worth sitting with, quietly, before the night carries this all away. And it's the question of who exactly is responding when a placebo works. Researchers have poked at this for decades, hoping to find a placebo personality, some stable trait that would let a doctor look at a new patient and know in advance how much of their relief might come from expectation rather than pharmacology. It hasn't really worked out that way. There isn't a fixed type of person who responds, a suggestible sort, separate from a skeptical sort. Responsiveness turns out to shift with context, with mood on a given day, with how much a person trusts the particular clinician in front of them, with what the illness is, and how long they've had it. The same person might show a strong placebo response to their headaches and almost none to their digestive troubles. This unpredictability used to be treated as noise in the data, something to average away. Now it looks more like a real feature of the phenomenon, a sign that the placebo response isn't a trait sitting inside someone waiting to be triggered, but something closer to a relationship, built fresh each time between a particular brain and a particular situation. That framing matters for thinking about duration too, about how long these effects tend to last. In many of the classic studies, placebo relief follows a familiar arc. It rises quickly, sometimes within minutes, peaks somewhere in the days that follow, and then gradually fades, especially if nothing reinforces it. No new visit, no new ritual, no renewed sense that something is being done. This makes a certain intuitive sense once you think of expectation as a kind of prediction the brain is making, because predictions decay when they stop being fed. A brain that expected relief and got some will keep expecting it for a while, the way a dog that hears a can opener will keep perking up at that sound for weeks, even if the treats stop coming. But eventually, without fresh evidence, the prediction weakens. Chronic pain studies sometimes show a small piece of the placebo response persisting for months, particularly when the treatment ritual continues in some form, but it is rarely as durable as an active drug, and it almost never simply keeps growing on its own. Which symptoms shift the most is its own kind of puzzle, and the answer keeps circling back to the same handful of systems, the ones with a short, direct line between brain and body. Pain, as mentioned earlier, sits right at the center of it, because pain is never a pure measurement of tissue damage. It's a construction, assembled partly from signals coming up from the body and partly from expectation, attention, and context coming down from the brain. Nausea works similarly, which is part of why so much of nausea research keeps circling back to expectation and conditioning. Fatigue, mood, the subjective sense of breathlessness, these all have a strong story-dependent component. Compare that to something like tumor size, or the level of a specific antibody in the blood, or the structural integrity of a joint, measurements that don't consult the patient's beliefs at all before reporting themselves. It's not that the mind is powerless there, it's that the mind's usual tools, the ones built for regulating alertness, threat response, and subjective discomfort, don't have a wire running to those particular outcomes. There's a cultural layer to all of this too.
one that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. Placebo responses are not identical across countries, and they're not even identical across decades within the same country. Studies of placebo response rates in clinical trials for certain conditions, stomach ulcers among them, have shown real geographic variation, higher in some regions than others, in ways that don't obviously reduce to differences in disease severity. Researchers have proposed a tangle of explanations: differences in how much patients trust doctors and institutions, differences in what a pill or an injection is culturally understood to mean, differences in how illness itself is talked about and expected to unfold. None of these explanations are fully settled, and it would be a mistake to treat any single one as the answer. But the pattern itself, that expectation, is shaped by the surrounding culture, and not just by an individual nervous system in isolation, fits everything else this story has been built on. A ritual only works as a ritual if the person performing it and the person receiving it share some understanding of what it means. Change the shared meaning, and you change the size of the response, even if the ritual itself looks the same on paper.
Even the way a clinician talks has been shown, in controlled studies, to shift outcomes measurably, apart from anything a treatment itself does. Patients told that a procedure would definitely help them, in warm, confident language, have in some trials reported less pain than patients given the exact same treatment, but described in flatter, more uncertain terms. This has occasionally been misread as evidence that doctors should say whatever sounds most reassuring, regardless of the facts, but that reading skips over something important, which is that the confident language in these studies was still true. The uncertainty was reduced honestly, not manufactured. That distinction is really the hinge on which the ethics of all of this swing, because once you know expectation shapes outcomes this reliably, a genuinely difficult question opens up about whether it's ever acceptable to lean into that mechanism on purpose. Giving someone a treatment they believe is more powerful than it is, in order to boost their response, runs straight into the deception that made the earliest placebo trials so uncomfortable to look back on. And yet withholding warmth, withholding clear and hopeful language, in the name of scientific neutrality, throws away a real and harmless source of relief for no good reason. The modern answer, as much as there is one, tends to land somewhere in the middle, on the idea that a clinician can be honest about uncertainty while still being generous with attention, still explaining clearly what a treatment does and why, still creating the kind of unhurried, attentive encounter that itself seems to lower pain and anxiety, all without ever needing to overstate what a pill or a procedure can do. The open-label studies mentioned earlier fit neatly here too, because they suggest that some of this benefit doesn't require any deception at all, that simply being told, truthfully, that ritual and attention and expectation can ease symptoms is itself enough to summon some of that easing. There's something almost tender in that finding, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. It means part of the placebo effect can survive full disclosure. It doesn't need a lie to work, in every case. It just needs a person to feel cared for, to feel that someone is paying attention, to feel that something is being done on their behalf by another person who wants things to go well for them. That feeling, it turns out, is not just an emotional comfort sitting alongside the medicine. In measurable, specific ways, for certain kinds of suffering,
It is itself a small piece of the medicine.
None of this resolves into a tidy final answer, and it probably shouldn't, because the honest shape of this research is still a shape with edges left rough, questions still being measured, mechanisms still being mapped one careful study at a time. What does seem true, gathered up from all of it, is that the brain a person carries into a clinic, or a kitchen with a bottle of aspirin in the cupboard, or a quiet bedroom at the end of a long day, is not a passive witness to whatever happens to the body. It is constantly, quietly forecasting, drawing on memory and context and whatever kindness or coldness it has just received, and those forecasts genuinely reach down into some of the systems that decide how much something hurts, how nauseated someone feels, how tired the day has left them. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough that the story of the placebo effect turns out to be less about tricking the body and more about listening to how closely the mind and body were already speaking to each other, in a language built long before anyone thought to study it. And maybe that's a fitting thought to let this particular night close on. The quiet, ordinary fact that your own mind, right now, in the dark, is doing something similar. It's forecasting. It's noticing the softness of the sheets, the low, familiar hum of the room, the simple absence of anything left to solve tonight, and somewhere underneath the thinking, it's already beginning to predict rest, the way it has predicted rest on countless nights before this one. You don't have to do anything with that. You don't have to hold on to a single fact from anything that's been said. You can just let the prediction run quietly on its own, the way it always has, the way it will again. Rest well.